The great John Barrymore, right?
Yeah.
Did you ever see any of his pictures at all?
For 30 years, Johny Carson was the king of late night. Every weeknight at 11:30, America turned to him for laughs, interviews, and that signature charm. But the best moments weren't the ones in the script. They were the times when something unexpected happened. When the camera caught Carson genuinely surprised, genuinely laughing, genuinely at a loss for words. These are when Johny Carson lost it. 5 real moments TV couldn't control. Moment number 5. Ed Ames and the tomahawk that changed television. April 27, 1965. The Tonight Show was broadcast from NBC studios in New York, still years away from its move to Burbank. That night's guest was Ed Ames, an actor and singer best known for playing Mingo on the TV series Daniel Boone. Ames had been on the show to promote the series and talk about his singing career, but the conversation took an interesting turn. Ed Ames was an interesting figure in entertainment. Born Edmund Dantes Urich in 1927 to Ukrainian Jewish immigrants, he'd first found success as part of the Ames Brothers, a singing group with his siblings that had hits throughout the 1950s. When that group disbanded, Ed transitioned into acting, and his dark features and strong bone structure led to him being cast in Native American roles. Mingo, on Daniel Boone, was his biggest part, a Cherokee character who was educated at Oxford and traveled with Daniel Boone through the frontier. On The Tonight Show that night, Ed mentioned that while filming Daniel Boone, he'd learned how to throw a tomahawk. It was part of playing a Cherokee character, and he'd gotten pretty good at it. For someone who'd grown up in Massachusetts and started his career singing pop songs, throwing a tomahawk wasn't exactly a natural skill, but the show required it, so he'd learned. Johnny, always looking for visual entertainment, perked up immediately.
Overhanded
It's an overhand throw. The trick is to keep your arm extended, and that way you break the microphone.
This was the kind of thing that made for great television. Could Ed demonstrate this skill for the audience? Of course he could. Ed was a performer after all. He knew how to give an audience what they wanted. The stage crew brought out a large wooden board with the chalk outline of a cowboy drawn on it. The figure was drawn in white chalk, a simple outline showing a cowboy with his arms spread, like a paper target at a shooting range. The target stood maybe 12 feet away. The studio audience watched with anticipation. This was the kind of spontaneous segment that made live television exciting. You never knew quite what would happen. Ed Ames picked up the tomahawk, felt its weight, lined up his shot. He'd done this dozens of times on the Daniel Boone set. This was supposed to be a simple demonstration of a skill he'd acquired for his job. The studio band played a bar of music from Adventures of Pow Wow, adding atmosphere to the moment. Then Ames drew back his arm and threw. The tomahawk flew across the stage in a perfect arc. It hit the board dead center. Well, not exactly dead center. It hit the outline square in the groin area, with the handle pointing straight up, creating an unmistakable anatomical suggestion. The audience reaction was immediate and explosive. Laughter erupted from every corner of Studio 6B. Not polite chuckles, not courtesy laughs. This was genuine, uncontrollable hysteria. People doubled over in their seats. The laughter built and built, wave after wave, showing no signs of stopping. It was as if the entire audience had been holding their breath and suddenly let it all out at once. Johny Carson stood there, hand over his mouth, trying to maintain some semblance of composure. But you could see his shoulders shaking. He was fighting it, trying not to lose it completely, but the battle was already lost. His eyes were watering from trying to hold back the laughter. The laughter from the audience kept feeding on itself, getting louder, lasting longer, building into something beyond anyone's control. Ed Ames, mortified and laughing at the same time, knew exactly what had happened. The way the tomahawk had landed, the way it looked, the pure accident of physics and trajectory that had created this perfect comedic moment, it was beyond anything he could have planned. He was embarrassed, amused, and amazed all at once. He started to walk toward the target to retrieve his tomahawk, to move past this moment and let the show continue. But Carson, in a moment of comedic brilliance, stopped him. He held up his hand, keeping Ames frozen in place. Let the audience see it. Let them appreciate what just happened. Don't rush past this moment. Johnny understood instinctively that this was special, that this was one of those rare accidents that becomes television gold if you just let it breathe. The laughter continued. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30. It became what many people still call the longest sustained laugh in television history. The studio audience simply could not stop. Every time it seemed to die down, someone would look at the tomahawk again, or remember what they'd just seen, and set off another round. The laughter had taken on a life of its own, beyond anyone's ability to control. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to a minute, Carson saw his opening. The laughter had started to subside just enough that he could speak. With perfect timing, honed through years of performing, he delivered the line, "I didn't even know you were Jewish." The audience exploded all over again, maybe even louder than before. Carson had taken an already legendary moment and somehow made it even better. He'd found the perfect thing to say, the line that acknowledged what everyone was thinking without being crude, that added another layer to the comedy. When the laughter finally died down enough for the show to continue, Ed Ames, still red-faced, asked Johnny if he'd like to try throwing the tomahawk. It was a good sport move, an attempt to redirect attention and let Johnny have a turn. Carson looked at the board, looked at where the tomahawk had landed, and replied with a straight face, "I can't hurt him any more than you did." Another wave of laughter washed over the studio. The segment had become pure gold, one of those moments that would be replayed on blooper shows and Tonight Show retrospectives for decades to come. Years later, when Carson did anniversary specials or retrospectives, this clip was always included. It became known simply as the Tomahawk Incident. Johnny hadn't planned it. Ed Ames certainly hadn't planned it. The stage crew who set up the target hadn't anticipated anything like this, but television had captured something genuinely funny, genuinely spontaneous, and genuinely impossible to script. It was physics, timing, and pure dumb luck combining to create a moment that millions of people would remember forever. Ed Ames himself would be asked about this appearance for the rest of his life. "Everywhere I go, people bring up the tomahawk," he said in interviews years later. It became the thing he was most famous for, beyond his singing career, beyond his acting, beyond everything else he'd accomplished. One throw, one perfect accident, and he'd created television history. Moment number 4. The marmoset that marked its territory. Joan Embry was one of Johnny Carson's most frequent and beloved guests.
Joan Embry's been coming on this show for many, many years, and it's always fascinating. She's from the San Diego Zoo and Wild Animal Park. Joan Embry.
As the Goodwill Ambassador for the San Diego Zoo, she brought exotic animals to The Tonight Show nearly 70 times during Carson's run, and even more if you count her appearances with Jay Leno after Carson retired. Each appearance was an adventure, with Carson never quite sure what creature would be placed in his lap or on his desk. The relationship between Carson and Embry was special. He trusted her, which is why he kept having her back despite his genuine nervousness around some of the animals. Joan knew how to handle these creatures professionally, and she also knew how to create good television. She understood that half the fun for the audience was watching Johnny react to whatever she brought. Over the years, Joan brought baby elephants that could paint, tarantulas that made Johnny visibly nervous, lion cubs that climbed all over him, rhinoceroses, cheetahs that refused to cooperate, and countless other animals. Carson was a good sport about all of it, even when he was clearly uncomfortable. He knew these segments were gold for the show. The audience loved watching him interact with these wild creatures, never knowing quite what would happen next. Sometimes the animals behaved perfectly. Other times you got television you couldn't plan if you tried. But one particular visit became legendary. It happened in 1979, though people who remember it sometimes place it in different years because the clip has been replayed so many times that the exact date has become fuzzy in collective memory. Joan brought a pygmy marmoset to the show. For those unfamiliar, a pygmy marmoset is one of the world's smallest primates, weighing just a few ounces and fitting comfortably in the palm of your hand. They're native to the rainforests of South America, and they're absolutely adorable. Tiny faces, expressive eyes, miniature fingers that look almost human. Cute, tiny, seemingly harmless. What could possibly go wrong? Joan explained a bit about the marmoset while it sat contentedly on her hand. She talked about their diet, their habitat, their behavior in the wild. This was educational television after all. The San Diego Zoo wasn't just providing entertainment. They were teaching viewers about animals they'd likely never see in person. Then, as often happened with the animals, the marmoset decided to explore. It wasn't interested in staying put while Joan lectured. It wanted to investigate its surroundings. The little creature jumped from Joan's hand to Johnny's arm. The audience made those collective awe sounds that small, adorable animals inspire. There's something about tiny creatures that brings out the maternal instinct in people. The marmoset climbed higher, moving from Johnny's arm to his shoulder. Johnny stayed still, letting it do its thing. He was used to this sort of interaction by now. After dozens of animal segments, he knew the routine. Stay calm, let the animal feel safe, make a few jokes, and eventually Joan would retrieve it and move on to the next segment or the next animal. But the marmoset kept climbing. It made its way up to the top of Johnny's head and sat there, perched like a tiny hat, its tail, thin and delicate, wrapped around Johnny's ear for balance. The audience thought this was delightful. Johnny, always the professional, kept talking with Joan, making light conversation while this miniature monkey perched on his skull like he did this every day. Joan was saying something about marmoset behavior, about how they're very social animals, how they communicate with each other, how they establish their territory. She was still in professional mode, still the zookeeper and educator. Then it happened. The marmoset, comfortable and content, decided to mark its territory, right there on Johny Carson's head, on live television, in front of millions of viewers. The tiny primate relieved itself, fulfilling a biological need with no awareness of where it was or what show it was on. There was a moment of stunned silence. Not long, maybe a second or two, but a noticeable pause where the audience processed what had just occurred. Then Johnny's face changed. You could see the realization hit him, the sensation, the awareness that something warm and wet was happening on top of his head, the understanding that this was really happening right now, on his show. The audience, understanding what happened, burst into laughter. Not cruel laughter, not mocking, just genuine amusement at the absurdity of the situation. Here was Johny Carson, the most famous talk show host in America, sitting calmly while a monkey urinated on his head. Joan Embry, ever the professional zoologist, calmly explained that the marmoset was simply marking its territory. This was normal behavior, perfectly natural. The marmoset had wrapped its tail around Johnny's ear, felt comfortable and secure, and done what marmosets do. In the animal world, this was a compliment of sorts. The marmoset felt safe enough with Johnny to claim him as part of its territory. Johnny, wiping his head with a tissue, looked at the camera with that expression he did so well. The look that said, "This is my life. This is what I do for a living." His face showed mock outrage, resigned acceptance, and genuine amusement all at once. Then, with perfect timing, he delivered the line, "I'm glad you didn't bring a baby elephant." The studio erupted again. Here was Johny Carson, the king of late-night television, dealing with the ultimate indignity, and he was making jokes about it. No anger, no stopping the show, no demanding they cut the cameras, just rolling with what happened and finding the humor in it. That was Carson's gift. He could make anything funny if he approached it with the right attitude. That moment became one of the most replayed clips from The Tonight Show. It showed Carson at his best, handling the completely unexpected with grace, wit, and perfect comedic timing. You can't script that kind of moment. You can't rehearse that reaction. It was pure Johny Carson, dealing with pure chaos and making it entertaining. Years later, people still ask Joan Embry about that marmoset. She's told the story countless times, always with fondness for how Johnny handled it. His acceptance and his response was so memorable, she said in interviews. To this day, people will describe that in great detail. The incident also showed why Johnny kept having animal segments despite the unpredictability. Because the unpredictability was the point. Because live television was at its best when things went wrong in interesting ways. Because a marmoset peeing on his head made better television than a perfectly executed, rehearsed segment ever could. Moment number 3. Don Rickles and the broken cigarette box. December 13th, 1976. Johny Carson wasn't hosting The Tonight Show that night. Bob Newhart was filling in, and the guest was Don Rickles, the legendary insult comic who had appeared on Carson's show countless times over the years. On Johnny's desk, among the usual items like pens and note cards, sat a wooden cigarette box. It had been there for years, a fixture of the set, something viewers had seen thousands of times without really noticing it. But that night, during a bit, Don Rickles picked up the box and started using it like a rubber stamp, slamming it down on papers as part of his immigration agent character. After one particularly hard slam, Rickles noticed something was wrong. The box had broken. You could see the moment of realization cross his face, the shift from comedy to genuine concern. This was Johnny's box. It had been on his desk since 1967, and now it was broken. Rickles went into mock panic mode, making a big show of the accident, but there was real worry underneath the comedy. He knew Johnny would see this. He knew Johnny would notice. The next night, December 14th, Johny Carson returned to host. He sat down at his desk, started going through his normal opening routine, and then stopped. He picked up the cigarette box. It was broken. "What the hell happened to this?" Johny asked, looking at band leader Doc Severinsen, who was filling in for Ed McMahon that night. "You know how long I've had this cigarette box?" Doc explained that Don Rickles had broken it the night before. "Had a bit of a fit when a joke didn't land," Doc said, and took it out on the box. Johny sat there for a moment, processing this information. Then someone mentioned that Don Rickles was in the building, right now, taping his sitcom CPO Sharky in the adjacent studio. Carson stood up. He grabbed the broken cigarette box. He motioned to a cameraman to follow him, and he walked out of Studio 1, across the hall to Studio 3, where Rickles was in the middle of filming a scene. The studio audience of The Tonight Show watched on monitors as Carson, broken cigarette box in hand, barged onto the set of CPO Sharky. Rickles was in the middle of a take when suddenly Johny Carson walked onto his set, camera crew in tow. "Stop the taping," Carson shouted. The look on Don Rickles' face was priceless. Complete surprise, sweat immediately appearing on his forehead, nervous laughter. This wasn't planned. This was Johny Carson interrupting his show on live television. "Someone broke my cigarette box," Carson announced, holding it up for everyone to see. "They told me you broke it on the show last night." Rickles tried to make jokes, tried to deflect, but Carson wasn't letting him off easy. "I want to know what you're going to do about this," Johny demanded. The two went back and forth, with Carson playing the angry victim and Rickles playing the nervous defendant. Carson insulted Rickles' show, made an unfortunately dated joke to one of Rickles' co-stars, and kept pressing Don about the box. Finally, Rickles asked if Johny wanted to announce him to the CPO Sharky audience. Carson turned to leave, but as Rickles introduced him, Johny spun around, glared at Don, and shouted, "They know who I am." Then he playfully slapped Rickles' face before walking back to his own studio. Both studio audiences, The Tonight Show viewers, and the CPO Sharky crowd were in hysterics. This was television magic. Two comedy legends, one broken cigarette box, and a completely spontaneous confrontation that couldn't have been scripted if they'd tried. Years later, Don Rickles confirmed that the accident was genuine. "That happened to be a genuine accident," he told the New York Times, "but we made it dramatic." The box wasn't some priceless heirloom, just a prop that had been on the desk for years. But the way they played it, the comedy they mined from it, turned a broken box into television legend. In 1978, nearly 2 years later, Rickles was guest hosting The Tonight Show. During a conversation with guest Carol O'Connor, Don absent-mindedly started slamming something on the desk. Then he realized what he was doing. It was Johnny's cigarette box again, either repaired or replaced, but there it was. Rickles stopped immediately, held the box up reverently, and recited what sounded like a religious chant to protect it. The audience, remembering the original incident, roared with laughter. Even years later, the broken cigarette box remained a perfect example of how Johny Carson could turn anything, even destruction of his own property, into comedy gold. Moment number 2. Tiny Tim's Wedding Spectacular. December 17th, 1969. The Tonight Show was about to make television history in a way nobody quite expected. Tiny Tim was one of the most unusual entertainers of the 1960s. Born Herbert Carey in 1932, he'd transformed himself into this peculiar character with his long hair, falsetto voice, and ukulele. He sang old-fashioned songs like Tiptoe Through the Tulips with earnest sincerity that made him either charming or bizarre, depending on who you asked. There was nothing ironic about his performance. He genuinely loved these old songs from the 1920s and 30s, and he performed them with total conviction. He'd appeared on The Tonight Show more than a dozen times in the preceding 20 months, and audiences were fascinated by him. He was different from anyone else on television. His mannerisms, his speech patterns, the way he referred to women as Miss, followed by their first name, it all created this persona that felt like it came from another era entirely. Some people thought he was putting on an elaborate act. Others believed this was genuinely who he was. Either way, he was compelling television. But that December night, Tiny Tim wasn't just performing. He was getting married, on television, to his 17-year-old girlfriend, Victoria Budinger.
And now here's the moment you've been waiting for, which a lot of people thought would not come to pass on this show, but it did. The wedding of Mr. Tiny Tim and Miss Vicky Budinger,
whom he respectfully called Miss Vicky. She was 20 years younger than him, barely out of high school, and about to become part of television history. In 1969, nobody got married on television. It simply wasn't done. Weddings were private ceremonies, family affairs, not entertainment. The idea of broadcasting something so personal, so intimate, to millions of strangers seemed bizarre. But Tiny Tim wasn't bound by convention, and Johny Carson was never afraid to try something different. If this strange performer wanted to get married on The Tonight Show, why not? It would certainly get ratings. The set had been decorated with 10,000 tulips imported from Holland, a nod to Tiny Tim's most famous song. The flowers covered the stage, creating this surreal garden atmosphere in the middle of a television studio. A makeshift altar stood where guests usually sat. The other guests that night, Florence Henderson and Phyllis Diller, were dressed for a wedding, wearing formal attire appropriate for the occasion. This was happening. This was really happening. The producer must have had concerns. What if it was a disaster? What if the audience found it tasteless? What if people tuned out instead of tuning in? But Carson went with his instincts, trusting that the sheer novelty of it would make for compelling television. Johny Carson opened the show with his monologue, and you could feel the anticipation in the audience. People in the studio knew they were about to witness something unprecedented. People have thought we have been kidding about Tiny Tim being married on the show, Carson said during his monologue. We are not. It happens tonight. And it did. The ceremony was brief, about 6 minutes. Tiny Tim, 37 years old, married Miss Vicky, 17, in front of millions of television viewers. They exchanged vows, they exchanged rings, and then they were husband and wife. After they exchanged vows, they sat down on the couch with Johny for a toast and a chat, just like any other guests. But there was champagne, there were congratulations, and there was this bizarre awareness that a real marriage ceremony had just happened on a talk show. But this wasn't just any other segment. This was television doing something it had never done before, bringing an intensely personal moment into living rooms across America. Some viewers thought it was beautiful, a celebration of love that they were privileged to witness. Others thought it was spectacle, turning a sacred ceremony into entertainment. But everyone watched. That was the thing. Even people who disapproved found themselves unable to turn away. The ratings were staggering. An estimated 40 to 45 million people tuned in that night, making it the highest rated episode of The Tonight Show up to that point. Some sources say 40 million, others say 45 million, but either number is astronomical. To put that in perspective, nearly a quarter of the entire American population watched Tiny Tim get married. In an era before streaming, before the internet, before viewers could watch on demand, 45 million people stopped what they were doing and turned on their televisions to watch this happen live. Johny handled the whole thing with his characteristic mix of respect and gentle humor. He didn't mock Tiny Tim or Miss Vicky. He didn't treat it as a joke or a stunt. He treated the wedding as a legitimate ceremony while acknowledging how unusual it was. That balance, that ability to be part of something strange without making fun of it, was classic Carson. He could participate in the moment without belittling it. After the wedding, Nick Lucas, the original singer of Tiptoe Through the Tulips back in 1929, performed the song for the newlyweds. It was a nice touch, connecting Tiny Tim's version to the original, creating a sense of musical history. Tiny Tim pulled out an auto harp and played a song he'd written specifically for his bride, singing about their love in his distinctive falsetto. The whole thing had a surreal quality, like watching something from another dimension that had somehow leaked into normal television. The marriage itself didn't last. Tiny Tim and Miss Vicky divorced in 1977, after 8 years and 1 child together. He went on to marry twice more, always keeping the Miss prefix for his wives, always maintaining his peculiar manners and old-fashioned courtship style. Miss Vicky remarried and divorced twice as well, eventually settling into a quieter life away from the spotlight. But that night in 1969, on Johny Carson's show, they created a moment that television had never seen before and would rarely see again. Johny Carson took a risk that night. He let something genuinely weird, genuinely unprecedented, happen on his show. In an era when television was becoming more corporate, more controlled, more afraid of anything that might alienate advertisers or offend viewers, Carson went ahead with a wedding that was strange even by 1960s standards. And millions of people watched, because that's what The Tonight Show could do. It could give America something it didn't know it wanted to see. The episode became one of the few complete Tonight Show broadcasts from the 1960s to be preserved. NBC erased most of the early episodes to reuse the tape, a common practice in that era when videotape was expensive and storage was limited. But they saved Tiny Tim's wedding. They knew even then that they'd captured something special. Decades later, the full 90-minute episode can be found on YouTube, complete with the original commercials, preserved as a time capsule of late 1960s television at its most ambitious and strange. Moment number 1. When comedy took over the asylum. Robin Williams and Jonathan Winters together on one stage. If you knew anything about comedy in the late 1970s and 1980s, you knew this combination was dangerous. Williams, the manic ball of energy who could improvise faster than most people could think. Winters, the master of controlled chaos, the comedian's comedian, the man who influenced everyone from Williams to Jim Carrey. When they both appeared on The Tonight Show together, along with actress Park Overall, Johny Carson knew he was in for an unpredictable evening. What he didn't know was that he was about to become a spectator in his own show.
Late Emmett Kelly estate sale. Picked up a little garment.
Look, if you can't wear one color, wear them all.
You're making...
Picasso was a lounge singer. Yeah, I've got to paint, tell me now. Put your eye over here, watch out, I'm back.
The segment started normally enough. Introductions, some setup for whatever they were there to promote. But then Williams got going. A joke led to a riff. The riff led to a character. The character led to another character. Williams was doing what Williams did, moving at light speed through different voices and personas. Winters, watching this, couldn't help himself. He jumped in with his own material, bouncing off Williams, adding his slower, drier wit to Williams's frantic energy. The two comedians started playing off each other, building on each other's jokes, creating comedy in real time. Johny Carson, sitting at his desk, realized what was happening. He was losing control of his show. Not in a bad way, but in the way that happens when you have two comedy geniuses who are more interested in making each other laugh than following any kind of structure. Park Overall tried to stay in the conversation, but it was like trying to board a speeding train. Williams and Winters had taken over, and there was no stopping them. The audience was in hysterics, watching these two masters of improvisation do what they did best. Carson, tears streaming down his face from laughing so hard, could barely speak. Every time he tried to steer the conversation back to something resembling a normal interview, Williams or Winters would veer off in another direction. At one point, Johnny just gave up, leaning back in his chair, watching the show unfold without him. "I've lost control of my own show," Carson admitted, which only made the audience laugh harder. And that was the beauty of it. Here was Johny Carson, the king of late night, the man who'd conducted thousands of interviews, admitting that these two comedians had completely taken over. He wasn't angry about it. He was enjoying it as much as the audience was. The segment went longer than planned. Nobody wanted it to end. The crew in the control room knew they had something special, the kind of television that only happens when you let talented people do their thing without worrying too much about structure or time limits. When it finally did end, when Williams and Winters had exhausted themselves and the audience needed a break from laughing, Carson looked at the camera with that expression viewers knew so well. The look that said, well, that happened. It was one of those moments that reminded everyone why The Tonight Show worked. Yes, Johnny was talented. Yes, he could interview anyone and make it entertaining, but he was also smart enough to know when to step back and let the guests shine. He didn't need to be the funniest person in the room every night. He just needed to create an environment where funny things could happen. Robin Williams would go on to become one of the biggest stars in the world. Jonathan Winters remained a legend until his death in 2013, but that night on The Tonight Show, they were just two comedians making each other laugh, making Johnny laugh, making everyone laugh. That's what live television could do. That's what The Tonight Show at its best could deliver. Not scripted comedy, not planned bits, but genuine moments of people being talented and surprising and impossible to predict. The magic of the unscripted moment. Johny Carson hosted The Tonight Show for nearly 30 years, from 1962 to 1992. 4,531 episodes, tens of thousands of guests, millions of jokes. But the moments people remember, the moments that get replayed and shared and talked about decades later, are often the ones that nobody planned. Ed Ames didn't mean to throw the tomahawk there. The marmoset didn't know it was on television when it relieved itself on Johnny's head. Don Rickles genuinely broke the cigarette box. Tiny Tim's wedding was planned, but the cultural impact wasn't. Robin Williams and Jonathan Winters didn't set out to hijack the show, they just started riffing and couldn't stop. These moments happened because Johny Carson understood something fundamental about television. You can write jokes, you can plan segments, you can rehearse until everything is perfect. But the magic happens in the moments between, when something goes wrong or right in an unexpected way, when real human reaction replaces scripted response. Carson's genius wasn't just that he was funny, it was that he knew how to handle the unfunny becoming funny, the planned becoming chaos, the expected becoming surprise. He could take a broken cigarette box and turn it into a legendary bit. He could let a tiny monkey urinate on his head and make it entertainment. He could step back and let comedians take over his show because he knew the audience would love it. That's timing, that's command. That's what made Johny Carson the king of late night for 3 decades. The Tonight Show still exists, still airs 5 nights a week, still books celebrities and does comedy. But television has changed. Everything is more controlled now, more produced, more aware of what might go viral or what might offend. There's less room for genuine surprise, less willingness to let chaos unfold on live television. Those 5 moments, and hundreds of others like them from Carson's run, remind us what we've lost. Not everything needs to be scripted. Not every moment needs to be safe. Sometimes the best television happens when you just turn on the cameras and see what occurs. Johny Carson knew that. He lived that. And for 30 years, he proved it every single night. If you enjoyed learning about these unforgettable Johny Carson moments, please like and subscribe to our channel for more stories about classic television that can't be recreated.